Tribute to Nioussere Omotunde Kalala. Every year at Afro-Sophia, we pay tribute to one of the greatest African scholars, Professor Cheikh Anta Diop, on February the 7th. On that occasion, we have the opportunity to release a report on the analysis of thoughts and actions of other prominent African descendants. This year, the death of Professor Nioussere Omotunde Kalala was a shocking and sad news. It was on the 14th of November 2022. We lost a great African researcher, a great star was deemed that day in Guadeloupe. A moving star went back to the universe of mystery our ancestors were. Death only fought against one of the greatest warriors in the redemption of Africa. Nioussere Omotunde Kalala, born Jean-Philippe Corvoux, died at 55. A prodigious African writer, historian, Egyptologist, anthropologist, linguist, Panafricanist, a thinker who thought that the first work of humanity starts in Africa. He contained the myth creators in Egyptology circles. He was the founder of the website Africa. He was also the founder of Hommage. He wrote a plethora of books, just like Cheikh Anta Diop before him. Omotunde challenged the Eurocentric version and the vision of history. His multidimensional topics and his large view on different methods and sectors of studies made him a masterpiece in African studies. As a strong African intellectual and scholar who was wholeheartedly devoted to the Renaissance of Africa, he taught classical African studies as classic African humanities all over the world, in Guadeloupe, Guyana, Canada, France, Africa, and elsewhere. He taught the greatness of Africa everywhere and all the time. He was a permanent intellectual warrior. He tackled the Eurocentric narrative and fought against cultural alienation. He was the defender of Afrocentricity, just as Professors Cheikh Anta Diop, Théophile Obenga, Molefi Sade, Ama Mazama, Juliet Smernalda. The restoration of the true history of Africa and the recovery of the dignity of Africans were his purposes. He brought out the truth that's been intentionally hidden. He demonstrated that European arguments on African history were unconvincing pastiches. History is full of lies because historiography is the way people write their interpretation of their history. History is not reality. History sometimes is a makeup. It's an ideological making and a political construction. Omotunde decided to reverse things by containing alteration in many narratives. He has strong arguments about the birth of mathematics in Africa. An untireable scholar, thinking, analyzing, studying here and there, discussing and writing every day and everywhere about the African reality of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He was a very kind man, very approachable and friendly human being, a man with overwhelming sensitivity and willing to share knowledge, a passionate and engaging man of knowledge. With his spectacular smile, he reversed the African history. Sadly, he is gone. He passed away at a moment when Africans needed his understanding and were expecting a lot from him. Prolific writer, Omotunde paved the way to destroy ideas which put down African history. He thought that sub-Saharan Africans created and developed came it by things most well known as the Holy Trinity, cattle worship, pyramid bearing with the Osirian bird alignment, etc. He said that colonial deeds came to cover the reality of our past. It came a pathway to intellectual slavery and cultural alienation. He produced a rigorous argument in favor of African Egyptology, blackness, the beginning of sciences, arts, civilization, alphabet, numbers, political organizations, the depth of Greek civilization to African pastoral realm, etc. African Egyptology was the main focus of Cheikh Anta Diop. Omotunde heard the call of his master, who wrote, "The African was understood as is the one who, after the reading of our works, will have felt a birth in himself of another person, compelled by an historical conscience, a true creator, a Promethean carrier of a new civilization, and perfectly aware of what the whole earth owns to his ancestral genius in all the domains of science, culture, and religion. Today, each group of people, armed with its rediscovered and reinforced cultural identity, has arrived at the threshold of the post-industrial era. An atavistic but vigilant African optimism inclines us to wish that all nations would join hands in order to build a planetary civilization instead of sinking down to barbarism." To speak of Omotunde is to recall the solid rock of Diop works. Omotunde added some other materials of bricks to keep building the wall of the African Egyptology. In Africa and the diaspora, the death of Omotunde sounded like a major loss because he was in pole position in African studies in the Francophone world. A brilliant African scholar, a man dared to challenge the experts' narrative on human history. He was committed to stay stronger against the falsifiers of history. He worked hard for the renewal of African history and culture. Members of Cercle de Tola said that the disease dedicated his research to describing hieroglyphs, exploring the rich Egyptian civilization and the ones that comes in the four corners of Africa in the successive glorious periods still unknown. Thus, following in the footsteps on his masters, his immense work has been devoted to the promotion of African classical humanities. His last conference was entitled "The Unquestionable Advantage and the Manifest Destiny of a New African Thought, Updating African Scientific and Technical Heritage for the Reconstruction of Global History of Knowledge." Through his various books, he reassessed, confirmed, and spread what Cheikh Anta Diop wrote. For example, the master said that in contemporary descriptions of ancient Egyptians, the question of skin color is never raised. Eyewitnesses of that period formally affirmed that Egyptians were blacks. On several occasions, Herodotus insists on the Negro character of the Egyptians and even uses this for indirect demonstrations. For example, to prove that the flooding of the Nile can't be caused by melting snow, he cites, among other reasons, he deemed valid the following observation: "It is certain that the natives of this country are black with hair." Other European authors say the same. If the Egyptians were not the same race, Diodorus' World Health emphasizes the impossibility of considering the former as a colony, as fractions of the latter, and the impossibility of viewing them as forebears of Egyptians. In his geography, Strabo mentioned the importance of migrations in history and believing that this particular migration had proceeded from Egypt to Ethiopia. He remarked the following: Egyptians settled Ethiopia and Colchis. Once again, it is a Greek, despite his chauvinism, who informed us that the Egyptians, Ethiopians, and Colchians belong to the same race, thereby confirming what Herodotus had said about the Colchians. The opinion of all the ancient writers on the Egyptian race is more or less summed up by Gaston Maspero. By the almost unanimous testimony of ancient historians, they belong to an African race, Red, Negro, which first settled in Ethiopia on the Middle Nile. Following the course of the river, they gradually reached the sea. Moreover, the Bible states that Mesraim, son of Ham, brother of Cush, the Ethiopian, and the Canaan came from Mesopotamia to settle with his children on the banks of the Nile. Cheikh Anta Diop supported argument in favor of Negro origins of Ethiopia through numerous social and cultural institutions such as totemism, circumcision, kingship, cosmogony, social organization, matriarchy, languages, etc. When he contended the arguments opposing a Negro origin of ancient Egypt, Diop, in response to the question, if blacks created Egyptian civilization, how can we explain their present decline? Stated, that question makes no sense, for we could say as much about the Pharaoh and Copts, who are supposed to be the direct descendant of the Egyptians and who today are at the same backward stage as Arab blacks, if not more so. Nevertheless, this does not excuse us from explaining how technical, scientific, and religious civilization of Egypt was transformed as it adjusted to new conditions in the rest of Africa. We can ask the same question about modern Greeks and Italians, descendants of Roman Empire. With a huge knowledge, Omotunde site-centered on African beliefs, culture, politics, economy, and history. He shared offerings of his own researches. By doing so, he empowered a lot of Africans and the younger generation. He worked with the UNESCO to promote African mathematics and the opulent African culture. His creed was a powerful message for the liberation of African history. He decoded relics and the secrets of many ancient scripts and manuscripts. He had a special show on television in Guadeloupe called Anthropology Thursday. He contended the fact that people followed the old teachings which were false, unreal, distorted, and ideological oriented. Those false teachings were based on weak foundations. He used to dismantle them systematically. His craving for the craving allowed him to harvest a lot of a new light in history. He worked with a new enthusiasm to sow young trees to feed the fuel of knowledge. His point was to enhance and move forward in the scene of containing theories in history as an academic discipline. Nevertheless, he was open-minded. Even he stood firm on his arguments. He was available for new challenges, discussing about everything in Africa history. He contending lies and falsification, which pose existential threats on African evolution. The horrible hegemonic disaster wouldn't reinforce its roots in sciences, even if it is powerful in international politics. The westernization of global history is now challenged. Thanks to Omotunde as one of scholars who fought bravely to achieve this goal. Thanks to him for revealing the truth. Western Egyptologists spread it throughout the world, their civilization, their way of life, their history and culture by studying the history of others. These contents are now openly said and written. Burgeoning the area, younger generation must resume what Omotunde did. In his remembrance, people must read his work, vulgarize and popularize it throughout the world. As Patrice Lumumba said in his last letter, one day history will say its word, but it is not the history taught in Brussels, Washington, Paris, or at the United Nations, but history taught in free countries from colonialism and its supporters. Africa will write its own history, and it will be from north to south of Sahara, a history of glory and dignity. Yes, Nioussere Kalala Omotunde has shown that Lumumba was not wrong. Africa will write its history. It will be not the history taught in New York, Paris, or Brussels. It will be the history of glory and greatness. Consciousness is very important. With Kwame Nkrumah, we have to say the struggle continues. To nourish the roots of African studies, Omotunde wrote several books on different topics. We have to salute the memory of good, happy and courageous soldiers who went back to Africa cosmogony and highest kingdom of stars and constellations. Omotunde means in Yoruba language, the guy who comes back at home from a pilgrimage elsewhere. Nioussere Omotunde went back in Africa after his journey at the other side of Atlantic Ocean, and now is going back to the kingdom of prestigious African ancestors. We can mention a little few works of his bibliography: African Roots of European Civilization, African Origin of Greek Knowledge, Classic African Humanities, Afrocentricity and Cultural Alienation, European Slavery Trade, Truth and Lies, The History of Slavery, Critical Discourses of Eurocentrism, Africa, The Cradle of Concept of Currencies and Money Standards, Pelagia, The African History of Europe. Omotunde put on his shoulders the hot potato of critical African history. In spite of thinking through the prism of the so-called European pundits, he suggested to renew the vision of Africa in learning their history. He was the right man at the right time to enhance young African scholars to analyze without fear everything written in European books on Africa. He pushed ahead and refreshed the African Renaissance. He cast his thoughts out when many other scholars tried to hide them themselves. By chance, there are many other researchers who decided to invest their energies in classic African humanities. Unfortunately, they are not yet started at school. Omotunde did what his mentor, Cheikh Anta Diop, asked from younger generations to reconnect modern Africa to ancient Egypt. He emphasizes it. Vis-a-vis Black Africa, Egypt has played the same role that the Greco-Latin civilization has played vis-a-vis the West. A European specialist in any domain of the humanities will be ill-advised to conduct any scientific work if he cut himself off from the Greco-Latin past. Similarly, the African cultural facts with only find their profound meaning and their coherence in their reverence to Egypt. We can build a body of disciplines in the humanities only by legitimizing and by systematizing the return to Egypt. To do so, we see that only the Egyptian facts allow us to find, here and there, the common denominator of the remnant of thought, a connection between the African cosmogonies in the process of fossilizations. The enlightened thinking of Omotunde opened new ways for African methodology, Negro ontology, and the spreading of the battle space of globalization of thought all over the world. The enormous amount of his literature on the ancient African history is advocacy for the rewriting of many false ideas produced in academic field. Omotunde was extremely popular in intellectual milieu as his master Cheikh Anta Diop. He was present everywhere the African history was under discussion. He provided deeper insight to throw a new light on the past of Africans and the so-called Dark Continent. He refused to deal with the mainstream idea on false African history as it was taught in Western schools. Facts are not novels, but a new wave of writers on Kemet plays a great role to change things and habits. They are now the sparrow in African studies. Committed to regenerate the history of Africa, Omotunde taught us that history is like a battlefield and a geopolitical project. Countries use history to subjugate others. Cheikh Anta Diop said to young Africans to be armed with science in order to resist to cultural submission. He said, this is also the place to say that no thought, and particularly no philosophy, can be developed outside of its historical terrain. Our young philosophers must understand this and rapidly equip themselves with the necessary intellectual means in order to reconnect with the home of philosophy in Africa instead of getting bogged down in the wrong battles of ethnophilosophy. By renewing ties with Egypt, we soon discover an historical perspective of 5,000 years that makes possible the diachronic study on our own land of all the scientific disciplines that we are trying to integrate in the modern African thought. Our time, the appointed time, is now. Thereby, we must learn about time and what must be done among Africans, Africa, and the Negro diaspora all around the world. Furthermore, we have to be present on this battlefield for essentialist and existentialist fight. To be, to exist, is to think about oneself. Think or die. Ideas lead the world. The one who does not produce ideas will be led and submitted by others. If you can't think, your neighbors will do it in your behalf. Omotunde finished his odyssey that he will embark upon all his existence in this earth, and now is back among stars in the sky. Let him rest in peace.